one, number three. Grass River, three R's. Grass River Railroad, why they didn't do G?
this. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to rumble? Hey everybody, this is Big Bill coming to you live from the greatest city in the world, Staten Island, New York. Well, that's great to me because I live here. Welcome to tonight's Who's Big Bill Talking To. Today's date is October 9th, 2019, Wednesday. We have a very, very special guest, that is all the way from Canada, uh, Lex Parker. Good evening, Lex.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for being a part of this show tonight. Thank Ralph Ronzetti for putting me in touch with you, and thank you for your gracious acknowledgement of being on.
It's my pleasure. It sounds like an exciting evening.
Yes, everybody has been texting and emailing me, telling me they keep asking for what time is Lex going to be on, and I said I don't know. Me and Lex are going to have lunch later today, and we'll discuss.
Well, I'm only here for a couple of minutes, so speed it.
Oh, okay. Good. It was a good thing we had lunch earlier together, me and you. So people think that we have a better relationship than what we do on video. Name drop kind of thing. Like, oh well, me and Lex were. But it is a pleasure to have you on. I'm going to save all. Yes, I was. Okay, for you guys out there that are watching right now, you don't see a picture of myself and Lex on there. John has just informed me that he's trying to get it on simultaneous broadcast on Twitch and Twitter, and we should be moving momentarily. This is where I start tap dancing. What's going on? See, this is called Murphy's Law.
Well, you did warn me.
We did. Now, see, we did give you a heads up on that. Did you work today, Lex?
I beg your pardon?
Did you work today?
Oh, yes. I usually go in around 6:30.
In the morning?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
I'm an early riser.
I've been doing that myself.
The office is nice and quiet. I get a lot of things done, and we're actually just getting ready for an open house. Because we moved our office after 27 years in one location downtown St. Catharines, and we moved at the beginning of the year. So an open house. So that's what we've been spending a lot of time getting ready for.
You're changing locations? I mean, office-wise?
Yeah.
Now, before we get into, because we're still waiting, the picture hasn't come yet. You're an interior decorator by design, interior designer, I should say.
No, I'm an interior designer, and
Right.
there is quite a distinction between interior designers and interior decorators. As an interior designer, we deal with building codes and structure, as well as finishes. Decorators basically do finishes.
Right.
That's usually like one of the last steps of my work.
Okay.
So we would do construction drawings and design, much like an architect or an engineer, in when we design restaurants and hotels and stuff.
Seem to be having a little bit of a technical difficulty here getting the video started, but we should be momentarily getting back on page here.
Want me to come back tomorrow night?
May have to.
This is like having an open house for a model railroad. Everything runs fine before people arrive.
The doors and the first guest comes in and everything goes to
Never fails. I had an open house last weekend, and actually everything ran well. I was surprised.
occasionally, yeah. I kind of freak out when I have people come over. Oh, we're back. We're back, Lex. Okay. Faux pas. Isn't that Frank? Okay, so here we are. We're back. So let's start again. Take two. Hey, welcome to Big Bill's Who's Big Bill Talking to tonight? And tonight's guest is Lex Parker. Please excuse our technical difficulties. We had the Gremlins show up and Mr. Murphy as well. And now we're back on track. And you have Mr. Lex Parker with us tonight. And he's all the way from Canada talking to us. And hopefully we can get through this. Well, thanks again, Lex, for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think this will be fun.
Well, it certainly has been. So far, anyway. Anyway, we get down to it. I just wanted to. We're gonna leave everything to the end, all the announcements, all the homework that usually I do in the beginning, because I really don't want to. I just want to really dive into, speaking to Lex here and some of his input and just conversation. That's we did the other night. We had a great tech tune-up the other night on Monday night, and we had a really good conversation. I hope we can pick it up from that. In discussing it with you about your model railroad experience, you said when we were talking, you said you got into model railroading. You said at the early age of 3 years old. How did that come about?
Well, my father was an engineer on the Bear Garretts. I don't know if some people know what a Bear Garrett is. And for those that don't, it basically has an extended frame, sometimes with one set of drivers, sometimes with two sets, and a tender on each end. So it's quite an unusual combination. I used to be an engineer on one of those. I didn't know that until my mother told me, probably, I'm guessing maybe five years ago, before she passed. But he was also, after I was born, so just after the war, he was a pilot for the British Air Force. He was stationed in Cairo. So I lived in Cairo for sometimes up to a year, and then go back to South Africa for a year, then back up to Cairo for a year. And probably in the conversations with him, because I don't really remember other than the drawings, I used to do little drawings of trains, with a locomotive and tender and a string of cars. And I used to do these drawings and send them to my grandparents who actually raised me. And my grandparents saved those pictures. My mother saved them as well, so I have them. So that's when my interest started, but when I was that young. And of course, in those days, there really weren't any models that you could get into. Certainly not in South Africa. There was nothing. And in the 40s. I came to Canada well, actually, I left South Africa in '54 and I went to England for 2 years, lived in England, and picked up the hobby there of train spotting, which.
Train spotting you were doing in England?
What's that?
You were doing train spotting in England? That's a big hobby over there.
It is a big hobby there. You get these little booklets for all the different regions and all the locomotive numbers. And then you'd go out, and try and, when you see a train, you'd mark them off and you try and see how many you would be able to track down. It's a big hobby there. And I got my first train set was a Hornby 00 three rail, and I used to just set the track up on the floor and run trains and so on. That's as far as that ever went. But when I came to Canada in '56, I picked up the hobby, picked up an Atlas set with a GP7, some cars and some track, and started a 4x8 layout, and just went on from there. I modeled because I'm here in Canada. I mean, it was CP, CN, and the local railroad was TH&B, Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo.
What part of Canada are you from, by the way?
I'm between Hamilton. Well, let's say Toronto, which is just around the end of the lake. I'm between Toronto and Niagara Falls, closer to Niagara Falls. So just near St. Catharines. A lot of people would know St. Catharines. I actually live in Beamsville, but nobody knows where Beamsville is.
And you live by the Niagara Falls area.
Yeah. Niagara Falls, about 30 minutes from where I live.
Yeah, I could hear the New York accent.
I better work on that.
Pretty soon you'll be sounding like me.
Thanks for the warning.
You're quite welcome.
Anyway, so that's where I really got more and more into model railroading, and I started to build a layout in the basement because I for a while, and all in HO, and then eventually got into what I'm doing today.
So your first real venture into a layout was an HO style layout. But,
That's right.
so as you said, that everybody that around you was modeling CP and all the Canadian line.
Yeah, all my friends in the group that I belong to, they model the same thing in HO, either CP or CN, and some with TH&B. When I say TH&B, those who don't know, that's the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railroad. It was a local railroad. I found that it was, I wouldn't say it wasn't interesting, but I wanted to offer them more than what I had, because when I went to their home, I was seeing the same thing. When they came to my home, they would see the same thing, basically the same kind of layout and operating. And I want to do something different. And one day when I was traveling on in an open gon at the East Broad Top on a little trip, I got to talking with one of the fellas that I knew about trying to do something different, and he suggested, why don't I look at O scale, and why don't I look at narrow gauge? Narrow gauge because you can pretty much build the same size layout in a given space as HO, because of the fact that it's narrow gauge as opposed to standard gauge, which would take larger radiuses, and everything is just much. The track is much bigger, and the curves will be bigger. It takes up more room. And then he suggested the Denver Grand Western. I never heard of that, and got my interest up. It just happened that there was a national convention for narrow gauge in Denver that next year. So my wife and I made a vacation down to Denver, and we spent a couple of weeks down there.
Well, if I don't mind, Lex, what year was that about?
I beg your pardon?
What year was that about?
That would be around 1978.
So the apex, the start of is now the Denver Rio Western Railroad was born back in 1978.
78, yes, yes. And so I went down to Denver, and then the railroad is actually the Denver to Rio Grande Western narrow gauge. Um, when it ceased to exist, was split in two, um, and one part that survived was in Durango, and is known as the Durango and Silverton, and
Right.
the other part that survived is in Charma, New Mexico, and it's known as the Cumbers and Toltec now. Um, the one in Durango is privately owned, and so they have a lot more restrictions. You just can't wander around, a lot of insurance issues and so on. And it runs between Durango and Silverton. It's a beautiful ride. Anybody going down there should definitely take it. In Chama, New Mexico, Chama is just south of the border of Colorado, and it is owned jointly by the states of Colorado and New Mexico. But when I saw that railroad, I mean, it was in a time warp.
Right.
Tourism really hadn't caught on back in the 70s like it is today. But it is literally, when I say it's in a time warp, it's all steam engines, all the original equipment, all the original structures. It is very laid back. You can wander around any way you want. Today, out of courtesy, you just notify them in the depot, and they just say, "Go ahead," just take care of certain safety issues. But you can wander around it, and the train runs from Charma to Antonito, and so it zigzags back and forth over the Colorado and New Mexico border. And that's the town I fell in love with, and so I've made several visits down there over the years. And when I go down there, I do a lot of photography for reference photos. I measure some of the structures, and I do construction drawings, and then I scratch build the buildings. And that part of my hobby now has evolved from those visits, and I started to build my layout when I moved from Hamilton. So that would be in 1981 when I built a new house, and I had a complete basement. I finished it off completely. So I had carpet on the floor, drywall was done, drop ceilings were done, lighting was done, everything was finished, ready to put the layout in. And I started to build that layout. It was a point-to-point layout. I only had half the basement because I actually operated my business in the other half. And of course, a few years later, when I moved my business out of the house, it became a family room for the kids. And that point-to-point essentially had two pull-out islands, and they were only about 8 to 10 feet long, and the rest of it ran around 3 walls. And the main island, which was only 8 feet long, was represented Charma, New Mexico. I like the structures there: the turntable, the coaling tower, sand house. Those are the basic structures.
Now, Lex, when just to interrupt you, when you were there, did you measure each of these structures that you were hoping and planning to build on the layout?
Certain ones, the major ones, I did some measurements and did some buildings on, and I didn't measure any of the town and so on. Those buildings. It was just mainly the railroad structures. And there aren't that many there. But further out on the line is another little town called Osier, Osier. It basically is a little whistle stop, and had a little depot there in the section house. I measured those, and I built those.
Right. Ralph Vanzetti has a question. He wants to know, Lex, did you bring back pails of dirt like Bill Scooby?
Yes.
And may I inquire as to why?
Uh, when I when I did my first layout, um, and it was mostly complete, and I tore it down in 1995, I think, because it was mostly complete, and I was bored with it because it was complete, mostly complete. So,
Wait, Lex, let me see if I have this straight. You did this layout, you loved the layout, you measured everything, and then once it was finished, you got bored with it, so take it down.
that's right. You see, for me, and I did an article, by the way, for model for Narrow Gauge Short Line Gazette. It never had any pictures of trains in it. It was just my layout, and it was the layout just before it was taken down. And essentially, the article is about the journey. And for me, it's in model railroading. It's the journey. It's
Very good. Very true. Yes.
not about getting there, because when you're there, you know, you're at the end of the journey, and what else is there to do?
This is true.
And but also, and the other reason is there were more materials and scratch building materials coming on the market, and my skills that had evolved, and what I could do at the end of that time frame was better than what I started the layout. So there were things that I weren't happy with in the modeling, but I'm not one to tear things apart and keep and redo them. That's a waste of time for me.
Right.
And so the other reason I took it down, when we took it down, I thought we might be selling our house, but we decided not to. And of course, the layout was taken down, and I had a fresh room to start with. And I thought I would, and my kids had moved out on their own. So now I have the whole basement. And I decided to, focus on Charma as the main theme for the railroad. And my track plan is almost exactly as it is in Charma today and was then.
Right.
And less one or two tracks in the yard, which I didn't have room for. And I added one extra track that I could store maintenance away equipment on, because I built a lot of maintenance away equipment, and you need a place to put them. So I designed the new layout as a loop, so I could run the trains around that area of the basement that I'd say I'd probably there's an image you'll see later. About 2/3 of the basement is my layout, and the other third is my shop, my work area. And so I decided to apply the things that I'd learned from the previous layout. And the key thing that was different, when we took the other layout apart, I mean, literally it was done with a Sawzall. I mean, how else do you do that? You cut it apart, and a lot of the sections went to other layouts. And I thought this just wasn't good. So I came up with an idea to have a demountable or removable layout. And I did that by building L-girders around the room, and they came up in the center of the room as an island. Well, it wasn't. It's an island, but it is part of the loop. And I did that because I wanted to be able to operate from both sides. And what I did was built trays, what I call trays. So they're 1x3 frames that would vary from, let's say, 2 to 3 feet to a maximum of 8 feet. 8 feet because of plywood. And each of those frames then was put on the L girders, and the mating ends were screwed together. So that in the future, all I had to do was undo those screws,
Right.
carefully cut on the joint of those trays, and then I could lift the whole thing out, and I could walk out with a section that would be very easy to be reassembled, or just as a single display, if that
Right.
was all it was going to be. The yard, so my Charmer yard went from the original 8 feet to 37 feet.
Ooh.
37 feet is the yard. And it's the only way I could depict the yard as it is today, with the yard, with tracks at one end for storage, the engine facilities that stretched out along the yard from the roundhouse down to the Colingham Town water tank at the far end. And so that's the main theme of my railroad is Charmer.
Right.
And because it's a yard, all that was done with plywood. So there were 3 sheets of 4x8 plywood on those trays. Well, the whole thing's hand-laid track, but it's all with spline base. So I would rip up tons and tons of pine spline and laid it on following the track planks. Now I should back up a little bit, if you don't mind. I had to design a layout to fit that room and the space. And when you see my floor plan, you'll understand it's not a square room. So I designed the track plan how I wanted it on my computer. And then I designed all the framing that would fit the space and carry the track. And so I did that on CAD as a layer. And then I did another layer with the lighting design above that. So all the track lighting and pot lights would be laid out to follow that track plan. And so that was how I processed, the construction. I made a commitment to build everything up to the finished track work so that everything would run before I did any scenery, I did anything else, because I've seen this happen with many other railroads where the guys would get very excited and build a part of a layout and start to finish it, then extend it and try to finish it. And pretty soon they don't finish it because time has gone by,
Right.
And I didn't want to be faced with that. So my commitment was to do this whole layout. And I spent 40 hours a week. I kept track of the time. I spent 40 hours a week for 3 months to build all the track work. And all my track is hand laid, tie by tie, spike by spike. And it just took that much time. It had to be wired so everything ran. I was using PFM. PFM had just come out when I started my first layout. So I was using PFM, and then I transposed the PFM system onto the new layout. Then there was a system called SDS that came out that allowed the PFM throttles to be operated wirelessly.
Right.
So I did that little conversion.
Yeah, I know.
What's that?
Now John's talking to me.
Okay.
So now what is the electronics that runs your layout now?
Well, because of the PFM system, the whole layout is divided up into blocks, and but I had two throttles, so two command stations in PFM. So the limitation was you could only run one engine on each system, and then with the blocks, of course, you could only be in so many blocks and so on.
Right.
So when DCC came out a few years ago, I decided to convert that. So I went to the DCC system, and I kept the blocks. I got rid of the PFM. I sold the PF system. I had to rewire a lot of switches to be DCC friendly, and the blocks I kept because I found that if you had a short somewhere in the layout, it was very easy to isolate which block it was in instead of
Right.
the whole layout.
Sure.
And so that's how I operate today. And after I got all the track work wired and all the layout operating, then I started with the backdrops. I started painting the backdrops, and I started doing, started with the scenery. I kept a lot of my structures. They're all scratch built from my first layout, so I was kind of ahead of the game a little bit.
Right.
I had to build a new roundhouse, and I had to build a new turntable. But my coaling tower and a couple of water tanks and some small structures I already had.
Right.
And I had a lot of rolling stock that I'd already built, and I kept all my engines, and so I was kind of ahead of the game in that way.
And next week, we talked earlier, is your birthday. Happy birthday, by the way. You've seen a lot of changes in this hobby. You've come a long way from when it was, you first got into it. And we talked the other night in regards to that. You said that you doing the hobby in itself paid itself because you were doing, no one else was doing it. So you pick up the mantle of weathering.
Yes, back in I would say early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, when I was still in HO. I was like everybody. I would collect Marlboro Railroader magazines, and I acquired a small collection of the old MMRs from back in the 50s and 40s, and the back covers were photographs of John Allen's layout, and I was inspired by a lot of his work, and I noticed how he weathered just about everything. Over the top from what I like, but at least they weren't shiny, out of the box models.
Right.
So I started doing that. I never had the luxury of an airbrush, so I would buy rattle cans of paint. I started by spray painting using the rattle cans, and later on when I did get an airbrush, then I would empty the rattle cans and use those colors in an airbrush. And I started doing my own weathering. A lot of it is done by hand with a brush. In 1974, around that period, we had a very good hobby shop here in St. Catharines, which unfortunately no longer exists, but it was probably one of the biggest, best ones in Canada, Niagara Central Hobbies. And I took my, I hadn't been there more than one or two times at that time. But then one day I took some of my models to the hobby shop to see if there was any interest in, pursuing painting for somebody. And the excitement was quite astounding when people saw locomotives and freight cars that were weathered in various degrees. And so I started getting orders from both the hobby shop and from customers to start painting all their equipment. And the revenue I got from that went back into the hobby to buy more equipment, especially when I converted, because after that trip to Colorado, when I came home, I made the decision one weekend, everything was on sale, everything had to go. I advertised it, and in one weekend, my entire layout, all my equipment was gone. That money obviously went back into starting to buy some brass locomotives in ON3, and that's how I got started in ON3. And for those who don't know what ON3 stands for, O is O scale 1/48, N for narrow, and 3 for 3 feet or 36 inches between the rails. There are other narrow gauge scales, 30-inch, 24-inch, 18-inch, which get to be smaller or mining types of equipment. And of course, the narrow gauge in Colorado was 3 feet, and so that's how that layout and that scale started.
I have a question from Andy Crawford. He says, Andy Crawford, one of our
Andy, yeah.
model railroad live guys, is IT guy, extraordinary modeler himself. He says, first, Lex, your layout is among one of my very favorites anywhere. And as I was once an old scaler, I'm currently looking at going back to O scale / Proto 48. My question is, how did you lose interest in operations?
Good question. My interest is in building. I enjoy building the layout. I enjoy building scenery. I enjoy building rolling stock and structures. I had to make sure that the layout that I designed, which is based on a prototype, so even the track plan is prototypical. Charmer, as I said earlier, the track plan is almost identical to the track plan that is there today, a couple of minor changes, which makes it operational in a very simple way, because there's lots of lengths and crossovers and so on. Once you leave Charmer at each end, it's a single line that goes around the rest of the layout, rest of the room. And that's what narrow gauge is all about now in the country. It's just a single winding line that just meanders through. It's not a spaghetti bowl. I never wanted anything like that, because it just doesn't work for the scale. And so there's one stop halfway across the room at a place called Osier, which essentially is a passing siding and a depot. And so it's a place to stop. So I did create a few areas for operation. So in the yard, you've got all the engine facilities. At the far end, as you leave Charmer, I've got a spur that's going to a sawmill. In Charmer, there used to be a sawmill there many years ago. Later on, it became a sheep dip. Sheep would go in and they dip them into a fluid to sanitize and wash them, because one of the industries in Colorado, New Mexico, is wool. Lots of sheep. So the country is basically designed, we use as for herds of sheep and cattle. So those are the two of the main industries, as well as mining. So because of the wool industry, I have there were two structures in Charmer that were warehouses. They called Warehouse A and Warehouse B. I had room for Warehouse B, but not A. And it was for the storage of wool. It was privately owned. And then when you went to Osier, you got to stop there. Then I have a spur that a gold mine, elevated. My grades are 4%, and 4% is the grades that the Denver Rio Grande Western ran. that was their maximum. So I used their maximum going up and down. And so there's a gold mine up there, which I'm currently building. And then partway between Charma and Osier, I have a stamp mill. And so I scratch built a stamp mill, and that handles the ore from the gold mine down to the stamp mill to be processed to separate the ore from the valuable minerals, whether it be gold or silver.
Right.
And so there is some operation, and the speeds for the trains are not high speed, so that involves time. There's lots of switching going on in the yard. So the layout is an operating layout, but I'm not an operator.
Right.
I enjoy doing switching around, but running trains. But I enjoy the fellows coming and running the layout for me. So
Okay.
I have open houses. I don't run trains. They do.
I have a question from Sparky 107. He wants to know, Lex, where do you shop? Well, actually, I have two questions from Sparky 107. He says he wants to know, where do you shop now for your modeling needs?
Can you say that again?
He wants to know, where do you shop now for your modeling needs?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have any. Once that hobby shop closed several years ago, there isn't anything around for equipment or building materials. But because I went down to, I attended a number of conventions in the States over the years, and so when I was at these conventions, or I went to hobby shops like Caboose Hobby, for example, I would buy detail parts, and always knowing that someday I'll need this. And
Right.
so I have quite an inventory of modeling and detail parts for scratch building. I use a lot of wood, and all my wood. I actually have quite a collection of scale lumber sizes. So I've kept, I've accumulated that. So when I need to build a structure out of wood, I won't got my materials. So I've accumulated over the years. If there's something I need today that I can't find, then I will call one of the suppliers and have them send me the parts. I make a list of parts, but pretty much everything has got to come, via mail. From the
Right. His second part of his question is, as on ON3, would parts, would they be not too hard to find up here in Canada if needed to repair some of your model? But I think you answered
A repairing model? Well, I don't know that I have much to repair.
No, I think it answers. I think your question was, answered. Both questions were answered.
Yeah.
Ralph Renzetti says, Sparky, when your name is Lex Parker, there is no issue of getting parts. That kind of like explains it, I guess. When in a brief minute, we're going to get to some photographs of your layout. How much from, like, when you're planning to start a build, when you're going to build something, scratch building, from the time of, from paper to finished product, how long does it take you to complete that project?
How long is a piece of string?
Ah, yes. Yes.
So I've built some models that are simple, like a little coal shed. I can do it in an evening.
Right.
My stamp mill took me 3 months working most evenings.
Right.
I really don't keep track of time. I could maybe explain something on the stamp mill later on. Um, but time, I don't keep track of time. Um, some models, I get tired when they drag on too long, and I put them aside because I'll get interested in something else. And it's probably common for most of us where we've got a lot of models or kits that are partially built.
Mm-hmm.
I have to go back to them another time when I feel like it again.
Right, right.
But my hobby is mainly a winter hobby. I don't do anything in the summer to speak of because it's in the basement and it's kind of cool. And I like being outdoors. I like doing things outside. So it's really a winter hobby. And because I've come a long way on this layout, I don't do a lot even in the winter. I might spend a few evenings or a few hours here and there, but it's not a ritual that I've got to be here, so many
Right.
nights, so many hours.
Right.
I don't want to be governed by something like that because there's enough stress.
Yes. Sparky 107 says, why ON30, ON3 scale, and when HO and even N scales are so much more accessible? What was your draw to that scale?
That's a good question because when I was in HO, I got frustrated with the amount of trying to put detail, and I like detail, and trying to put detail on small models. And I thought, okay, I'll go to O scale. It's bigger, it'll be easier to work with. Well, lo and behold, I discovered that it just meant I had to put more details on. It was not a win-win situation. But again, I went to O scale because it was different than all the other fellows in my groups that do this, and it was easier for all of us to see. It's certainly at my age and with dexterity and eyes, not like they were 20, 30 years ago. The larger scale is easier to work on.
Right. Right. Well, on one of the things that we talked about the other night, and which I thought was pretty wise, and also I think it would be important for those guys that are out there on doing models. Like you said that you were doing one of the bigger ones, scratch building, but you realized it was a little bit overwhelming until you compartmentalized it and did one section at a time.
I'd say the two biggest projects that I've done, and I don't consider the cooling tower and the water tanks to be large projects, but the two biggest projects that I've done, one was the pin-connected bridge at Cimarron and the stamp mill. Both of them took me 2 to 3 months to do every night, most nights, let's say, and number of hours on weekends. And in both cases, whether it was the bridge or whether it was the stamp mill, when I look at the overall project, it's a huge project. And if you look at it that way, it can be very discouraging to moving forward and doing it, with the fear that, I'll only go so far and then I'll quit. Now I got another structure that who knows when I'll get to. And so it became a good lesson to break those models down into small components and just do that as a project. So for example, on the stamp mill, I did all the construction drawings and I laid the construction drawings out, and then I put little blocks on each side of the drawings for timbers, like each wall elevation, and then I would distress and prepare the timbers, and I do maybe one wall in an evening,
Right.
then another wall another evening, and after a week or 10 days, I had the walls all done.
Right.
Then I could sort of set them up on the base and pin them together to get a sense of how it was coming along. Then I did all the interior details, and they're all the interiors are all kits from CHB and Western Scale Models, and so the kits themselves are beautiful white metal castings, but they have to be built individually, and there's a lot of them. So I would just take one of them at a time. Whether it be the boiler or whether it be the steam engine, and I would just do that as a project. And so I had a model of a component, and I just go back and do another one. Some would take one evening, some would take a week to do. Steam engine is fairly complicated, and I just put them aside. Well, after a while, after I got through the back and the two side walls done, I had to leave the front open so I could access it. Then I could start placing these in place and start figuring out where all the line shafts and all the pulleys and the belts would go.
Right.
I had them built. I didn't have to figure that out on a blank slate.
Right.
So that was a lesson well learned, just to deal with one component at a time.
Right.
The pin connected bridge was another one. A pin connected bridge is it's a steel bridge. I think there's a picture of it that you'll see, and I'll mention it when it comes up. And all the vertical beams are channels, individual channels, and all the fretwork, the lacing in steel webbing, that's all riveted. Now that came as an etched piece of brass, but to build each one, it's a lot of work. So I just took that as a project, and then the cords, and then the deck, and slowly assemble it. The most complicated part of that was all the diagonal rod bracing that is on the underside of the deck, the trestle, the bridge, I should say, and through the middle of it, tying the two sides together, are all X bracing. But it's a pin connected bridge. So at each end of every one of these rods, I had to create a little loop, and they had to be exactly the same size. And on each of the structural components, the legs, I had to make up brass brackets that I would solder to the beam or whatever it's going to be, because those hooks those bars with the loops at the end would come from two different angles. They had to line up, and you had to drop a pin in. So I actually have them all pinned.
Right.
So again, it's very fastidious. So you just do a little at a time, and that's how you build the whole thing up.
Right.
So that was the best.
Andy Crawford has an interesting question. He goes, Lex, as a craftsman structure builder, where do you land on the debate of modeling nail holes?
Modeling nail holes?
Yeah.
I put nail holes whenever I can, wherever they're needed.
There you go.
And all my box cars, all my structures, anything that's got planking, and I don't use scribe siding. All my walls, anything that I build the walls are individual boards, and they match the framing. I know that sounds a little bit anal, but
No, not at all. I think
a little bit unique. And what I do for nail holes, I use an HB pencil. I keep a very sharp point, and they press it in wherever. Not some guys are doing it. It looks like they've got a whacking big nail like that, but you only need to have enough of an imprint just to give a sense that there is some kind of attachment to it.
Dan Wardo, TRP, says keeping the building as components keeps the burnout effect from happening. Very true. Very true.
It does. Really, that's probably the most important lesson I could give anybody, and to myself, is even a small project. don't get overwhelmed by it, because it's a hobby. You got to enjoy what you're doing.
Sometimes we tend to forget that, Lex.
You do forget that,
Yeah.
and if you burn yourself out, you'll never go back to it. You do tend to put it aside.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely correct. One of the things I think that a lot of people may know or may not know, you were actually a National Model Railroad MMR number 300. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's a unique number.
Yeah. You want the story?
Sure, why not?
So I can't even remember the year now, but I was fortunate that I built a lot of rolling stock. I built a lot of structures. I built a layout. I volunteered for a number of conventions. The National NMRA convention that was held in 03 here in Toronto, I was on the committee on that. So I had some advantages, having built a lot of things. And so one of my friends, some may know him, Bill and Mary Miller, down in Maryland, both MMRs. Both he and she are MMRs. And they said, Lex, why don't you go for your MMR? And I never really thought about it before. So then I thought, well, sure, why not? It doesn't mean anything to anybody else. But I mean, the only reason I think you should be an MMR is it's a confirmation to yourself of what you can achieve or have achieved. It doesn't, to me, it's not, well, I am an MMR. It doesn't mean it to somebody else. It's only for personal
Yes.
satisfaction and recognition. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. Got all the paperwork. And so I went through each certificate, filled out the paperwork, built the models, made the revision, whatever I had to do. And I pretty much had it all finished in 1 year, and submitted it. And at that time, I think the latest MMR was, I think, something like 287. And so I thought, I don't want to be 289. I don't want to be 290. I don't want to be 293. I like 300, you know. So I sent a letter when I made my submission, I sent a letter to the officials at the NMRA, and I requested, would you hold my MMR until such times as 300 became available? And they agreed, and I was extremely grateful. I waited probably a year and a half, and as it turns out, the NMRA had a national convention in Ottawa, and it was held at the Steam and Technology Museum in Ottawa. And I was awarded and I had 8 certificates. You only require 7, and I had 8 completed because I'd also done some in several articles as well in magazines, and I designed websites for them and all kinds of stuff. So I was awarded my 8 certificates at the convention, which was, a real honor.
Yeah.
And it was great too, because the venue was in the main gallery of one of the galleries for the locomotives, and we had 2 big CP Northern and a CN Northern flanking both sides of the dining.
Oh, that must have been nice.
It was absolutely spectacular. Yeah. And then what was a real surprise and very much meaningful to me even today is Bill and Mary Miller, as I said, both MMRs, very good friends of mine. Bill recently passed away, unfortunately. Unbeknownst to me, they had a plaque made up with a section of a railhead and a plaque with my name, and they presented that to me as an achievement in addition to the MMR. So that's where that story came in.
Nice. John, can we look at some of Lex, some photos that he sent of his layout? I think the community would love to see those. Oh, he got tired of trying to put them up. One thing about Lex, one thing I saw Lex's Lex layout many years ago, and one of the things that and we talked about this, if we show it in the photos, one of the things you'll see is that there are handrails on the outside of Lexus's fascia boards. Why do we have handrails outside on your fascia?
It's
We'll get there. Don't I'm just yelled at boys and girls out there. And
while John's looking,
Wild John, very nice segue there, Lex.
to go to one of the questions earlier about did I bring back dirt from Colorado?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. And I also shipped some back. So that must have been very interesting going across the border through customs to opening a box and seeing a box of dirt.
Huh?
I'm sure they dug through it. But one day I sat in the ash pit in Strasbourg. I took a cardboard box. I made a sieve on a square frame, sat in the ash pit, and I sieved all the ashes into a box, filled up a fairly good sized box of ashes, and most of that is on my layout. I used it as ballast because it has a certain grain to it that's perfect scale. But a lot of the track work of the Denver Rio Grande West and narrow gauge has a lot of cinders in it. When you go through the yards, for example, only the railheads show. There's so much, coal dust and cinders throughout the yard, and so I duplicated that pretty much all through the layout, where to match whether it was yard or country. And you ready? All right, so that's the Coaling Tower and the Sand House in Charma, and the both in the water tank down at the end. So again, the positioning of my structures is exactly the same as it is in the yard. Following the yard track plan.
Now, I'm just commenting on this as now. This is all scratch built. This is all from
scratch built, board by board.
Board by board.
And the track is all hand laid. So you can see, all the rail is spiked, and I use code 83. So code 83 for the rail. If any guardrails in switches and on trestles and bridges, I use code 70. And the reason for that is I usually paint those. So when you're cleaning with a bright boy some of the rail heads, you're not going to be going across the guardrails. That's 456 K27. All my locomotives are brass, and that's all that's all weathered and painted. I put sound in them, and what else?
That is an absolutely stunning scene right there.
On the right hand, that's the sand house, and that's the sand bin just running off the picture. Again, what I did there for the logs is the posts themselves. They are dowels, but I shave and give a little bit of shape to them. But what they do is they take they hack off all the branches and so on. So you usually get these little nodules where the branches came out with a knot. So I used wood putty, made a little blob of wood putty on different spots and sort of feathered it into the post, so that you had that texture looking like where the branches would be lopped off. And, then there are steel rods that go from near the top to the one on the opposite side to hold the two bins together. So there's steel rod, and there's NBWs on the ends of them. the tar paper roof on all my passenger cars and structures is Kleenex tissues. Because
Good.
scale, it's all about scale, and paper and anything else is too thick. So I take 1 ply of tissue and I cut it into 3-foot width strips, and then I just lay it on the roof. And one time I was gluing them in place, and another time I realized I don't have to glue because the paint's the glue. So when you
Right.
then you dab the paint on the surface, it goes through the Kleenex to the cardboard structure underneath. When it dries, it glues. It bonds. So that's what I do with the tar paper roof. All that is built today. The can you go back one, John, if that's possible? Just gonna finish. Yeah, on the sand tower, you can see the delivery pipe, and it extends. That's the way it was originally. Today, it's just a hose. It looks terrible. Oh, and by the way, what I didn't mention that is my time frame. My model takes place on October the 17th, 1937 at 4 p.m.
Okay. Why October 17th?
Okay, it's the only date I could probably remember because that's my birthday.
Okay.
1937, because after 37, 38, 39, the herald that's on the tender, that's the oval or round herald,
Right.
it changed to the flying Rio Grande, the flying herald. So it's a completely different design. I didn't like that. I like the old time. The other reason I like 1937 is post-depression. So
Right.
you got justification to do a certain amount of weathering, and I don't try to do weathering that is things that are so dilapidated like they might be, say, in logging scenes in the wood with all the dampness and so on. I've tried to make this the way it actually looks or would have looked at the time. So it's post-depression. So money's tight, materials are tight, but they do take a bit of pride in their equipment and their structures, and they do try and do whatever maintenance that they can. It's not been ignored. And
Why 4 p.m.?
well, that's when everybody comes home and goes to the bordello and pool hall.
Oh, of course. What was I thinking?
I know. Okay. Now this is a lot of what I do, whether it's painting or building models or scenery. I'd say 80% of what I do is experimental, and I wanted to do a cut through one scene through here. So it's just plaster of Paris that is wiped down with utensils just to give that kind of a streaky look and spray painted. And then the top, I wanted the grass to look like it's hanging over the edge as it's eroding on the underside. So it was just strictly an experiment, and I used different grasses, the artificial grasses that you can buy. Just laid them on the edge, glued them down, and then sort of pulled them over the edge just to look like it's eroding. And the other thing that I did was, when you look at backgrounds where a scene like this goes into the wall, you get that knife edge. So basically your scenery is going in and you see a 90-degree edge. So what I've done here, wherever that happens, is I rolled the plaster, I rolled it up into the wall, so you don't get that knife edge, and then the ground foam and the brush and so on is all applied up into the wall slightly as well. So
That's the background. That's what you painted? Is that correct?
Yeah, and the upper part is just all the paintwork for the mural.
That was interesting.
That's all just done. Yeah, and a little lower actually, John. you know, right through there would be where it meets the wall.
When you decided to paint your backdrops, it was an interesting thing. It started, you told us, you went out and purchased the brushes.
I knew what I wanted to paint to some degree. So I you have to have a background, of some sort, because a lot of the layout gets lost otherwise. So I don't have the use of an airbrush like a commercial airbrush. So I painted the sky blue first, and I people often say, well, what color is the blue? It really, there's all kinds of blues. Just pick one. The sky doesn't stay the same. So I got what I thought was the sky blue and white, and I started from the top, and I just used a standard 8-inch roller, and I painted the wall. And as I came down, I had another tray with a bit of white, and then I just put a little bit more white in, and I'd mix, but then I'd roll it back and forth over a lot of times, almost dry brushing to blend it with the roller so that it got lighter as it came down to the horizon. And then I went and bought all these expensive brushes to paint the mural. I got these are artist acrylic paints, and be honest, I found it hard to really paint with these brushes, because what I did not want to do is, and I couldn't do, would be a realistic painting as if it was like a photograph. Because for me, what I wanted to do was the background to be a caricature of what I was painting, not a photographic representation. I didn't want it to compete with the layout. I wanted it to be subordinate to the layout. Well, I found that difficult, and then I started painting. So then I threw all that aside, and all my murals are painted with a fan brush, a $1 basting brush out of the kitchen drawer, a sea sponge, which is nice and coarse, and one of my wife's makeup sponges, which is nice and fine. Everything you see is done with those 4 utensils. Cost me $5.
See? That's what we've been preaching here.
What's that?
That's exactly what we've been preaching here. And Andy Crawford are big on go to the pharmacy and go to the makeup section and get these.
Yeah. And on my website, I do have a PDF that you can download explaining how I did a lot of this, and helping to understand where you have a horizon, because you have to know 2 things you need to know when you paint a backdrop. You need to establish the horizon, and I snap a chalk line on the wall where the horizon is, because if the horizon is high, then you are elevated and you're looking down on the land, and it won't look right.
Right.
Low, then if it's too low, then it's like on a mountain looking down at it. So you've got to be, generally, well, it depends on your layout, but I would say within 6 inches of the tabletop.
Right.
Because you want to
the track that's in the foreground here. How far is that from to the landscaping?
Oh, that's probably inch and a half.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then the slope cuts back, because it's as if they came along with a machinery, and they're just scalping as
right, scouted down
and clean up the debris as it comes down. Yeah. And in front of the track is a river. You'll see that later. This is the car shops. This was partly scratch built and partly kit. The four walls, plaster walls, are Thomas York. He built it. He had a kit that was for an engine house that had 4 plaster walls that I thought were outstanding. His models were just outstanding for detail. But I reconfigured the building using his plasma drill press. There's all kinds of tools and so on. The building at the top with a bit of green, that's actually an addition on the back. It's a scratch built building that houses the steam engine and the boiler. And there's a large flywheel, and that's the leather belt that comes out over it to drive the line shaft. So there are pulleys and line shafts that run all the machinery, and the belts themselves. All the belts that you see on my models for line shafts, I use drafting vellum. It's not paper, because paper. Most kits, if they have them, it's usually paper, and you only have to touch it once, and then it breaks, and then what do you do?
Right.
So these are all this. I cut this all from drafting vellum, which, because it's for architectural drawings,
Right.
it's inert. It's very, very strong. You can't snap it, and it doesn't move with humidity. And then the rest is just, I poured a plaster floor to represent concrete, put cracks and joints in it, and a lot of oil spills and so on. And then there's just a myriad of just junk tools and parts all around.
It's fantastic.
Couple of rod beams go across that have its own pulley that can run a little crane to lift parts up and down and move across. Nice big windows, and then the roof itself is all framed as well. The roof that goes on this has all the framing inside with trusses, and I've hidden 2 light bulbs in there to help light the interior. Most of these don't have light fixtures because there wasn't any electricity in these buildings, so they use lamps in natural daylight.
Right. And sure, kerosene lamps and.
This is just on the far right at the back. That's that cut that you saw a couple of pictures ago, and so this is the main line coming from Osier. That's halfway around the layout, on its way around back into Charman. This is snow train out doing a test run.
Getting ready for the season.
What's that?
Getting ready for the season.
Yeah.
Snow season.
You got to make sure everything is running. So
yes,
at the front of the locomotive that runs off to the left is a rotary snowplow. Between the engines is a flanger. The D&R GW narrow gauge had 10 flanges. They're all numbered with a 0 in front. All their maintenance away equipment always starts with a 0. All 10 are completely different. So my aim is to build, or was to build, all 10 of them. I built 4 of them so far, and I still got the parts for the rest. All the blades are out of brass, and they're all different configurations. And then they got the river at the front here. This river runs along the front edge of the layout. Typically, railroads follow the river courses.
Right. True. Very true.
The track at the back is actually, this is a 7% downhill, and then 4% down, and then there's 4% going up, and that one goes up into a mountain and comes out at the upper end at a gold mine.
Andy Crawford says, is that drafting vellum paper, the stuff they call onion skin that you use on the?
No, onion skin. You could use onion skin. It'll tear more easily. No, drafting vellum is like Mylar. It's so it's like a vinyl plastic, very thin.
Okay.
It comes with a matte finish on one side and a glossy finish on the other side. You usually draw pen or pencil on the matte side because it holds the media.
Okay. Dave BSS BNSF N scale says you could spend hours looking at every foot of his seams. Oh, now this is interesting.
Okay, this is the stamp mill. This is just one shot inside the stamp mill. This is all, again, scratch built, and I do a lot of research. This is a great part of the hobby. When I go and build something, it doesn't matter whether it's the tool shed or a roundhouse or the stamp mill. You got to do some research. You have to understand how it works. At least if you're going to do the interiors. So I spent a lot of time researching how a stamp mill works, and all the castings. They're all individual parts. I mean, none of this comes ready built, but they're all. Most of these are either from CHB, which is Charlie Brommer. He did some fantastic castings in all scales back in the 70s and 80s. He passed away a long time ago, so I was very fortunate to have a lot of his kits. And Western scale models continued with. I think they took a lot of his molds. They no longer make O scale ones, though. Apparently, I probably got the last of them. But this is the interior of the stamp mill, and at the top, above what you can actually see, the ore comes in at the top and drops through some grates. And there are bins. I think there are 4 bins underneath the floor, and that is delivered through chutes through the back of the stamps, which are those vertical rods. There's a spinning disc on the back that feeds the crushed ore or the rough ore into a box at the bottom of the stamps. You're only looking at the top half of the stamps here, and the rod going through, those are camshafts. So each of those cams, the shiny spot, you'll see the rod just underneath the main beam. You'll see what looks like a little block of iron above the cam. You put your mouse on there, John? I'll tell you when. Okay, right. Okay, those blocks of iron attached to the rod, and they sit on the cam. So as the cam rotates, it lifts that rod up, because at the other end of the rod is a huge block of iron, and each one of those weigh about 1,000 pounds. So what it does is lifting that, and then the cam, it drops off the end of the cam, and then that's what drops the hammer down and pounds the rock, crushes it into powder. So you got 20 stamps there, and they're all bang, 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 bang. They're just a cacophony of sound. I don't know how these guys ever had hearing when that
Probably lost their hearing.
Yeah, the rods at the little bars along the bottom towards the left that you see, those are actually bars that when they lift, if they're going to do repairs, they would lift the cam up, and they'd lever that under the cam so that it didn't drop, so they could lift one of those rods out if they had to repair or replace the hammer at the bottom. And so at the top, you can see the chains hanging down. And
Right.
Just off the picture, unfortunately. I have a track that runs on a truss across above that, which travels back and forth so they can lift those rods out.
How was the cam made? How did you do that?
Well, each cam is just a white metal casting,
Ah.
and then so it's not like a full circle; it's like a half circle.
No. Yeah, no, I know. I just was wondering how.
And then you have to. Each one is in a different radial position.
Position, right?
And all dropping down at one time, so it's just bang, 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 bang. Yeah, they're randomly dropping, and so I just have to drill a size hole through all of them, and put a rod through them. I put a stainless steel rod through, and then glue them, in place. And then there are brackets that support that on those vertical posts.
Absolutely stunning. Ken Amos Jr., BNO 51, says both these pictures on a 65-inch plasma look beautiful. Absolutely stunning, detailed work.
All these pictures that you see, I just took on my iPhone. And so this is just an overall look at the yard. Directly in front of me, that you can't see off the picture, is the town of Charmer. The street there is the main road that goes along the front of the stores, and all the stores face the yards. And this is exactly how when you go to Charmer, this is what you see. This is the road. The street is called Terrace Avenue, and all the shops and hotels and bars face the railroad. And so you'd walk across the street, you go down a little hill, and that's where the yards are. And the tank cars, between the two lines of tank cars is actually an oil dock, and that's there today. I had drawings available, and I also checked and measured some things that I needed. That's all scratch built. It feeds 4 tank cars on each side. Then as you go back, you can see the water tank on the left and an oil shed beside it, which we'll come back to later. And then you'll see some maintenance away equipment on the last track. There's 2 tracks that actually feed the roundhouse. And then between those maintenance away cars that you see and the backdrop, that's a 4-foot aisleway.
Oh,
This is part of the layout that runs up the middle of the room. It's not on the wall. And I wanted the width, because when one of my requirements for building a shelf layout, which is what I've got, is that you have to be able to reach the furthest track at arm's reach. This is 5 feet across, that layout.
right.
In order to get the yard, the town in there, I had to have a wide piece. So that's actually a 4x8 layout with a sheet of plywood underneath that, with an overhang for the street. So that's why I have to have an aisle on both sides, so I can reach the track from both sides. But it also, another thing I learned from my first layout, I had to have wide aisles, because when people come, I had places where it was only 2 feet between the island and the layout, the last layout. People can't pass. But
Right.
I've got 6 feet between this island and the layout on the wall behind me, and there's the 4-foot aisle on the far side, so people can be on both sides of the layout to look at it.
Very, very nice. The detail.
I'll talk faster. This is a scratch-built blacksmith shop. Again, I build all the framing. The wall comes off. I've got the 4 corners have pins that go into the base, so you can lift the walls up, which help to do the interior detailing. And the roof comes off as well, and it's all trussed and so on.
Where do you get your figures from?
Charlie Bramo, CHB, made some figures, not the quality of today. Aspen models, probably most of my figures are Aspen. They're really good. They do the horses and the figures. None of them are here, but the latest ones that I just bought are actually made in Australia, and they're 3D printed, and they're absolutely incredible.
I believe it.
The most realistic, because they're actually taken from actual figures of people. This is Osier. This is what's halfway around the layout, and you got the depot on the right. The main line is the one in the front, and it spurs off as the switch goes to a little siding where there's a stock pen for sheep. The locomotive is actually on the passing siding, and you can see the sheep being herded in, to the stock pens. And you can see my ballast and the gravel. That's all the cinders. Thank you to Strasburg Railroad. You see, it has a nice effect. It has a
Yes, I was just going to say that. Yes, it does.
All my trees are all handmade from bottle brush technique or the aspen. Use the aspen in the background. That's where I use my wife's makeup sponge because it's very fine. And
Right.
I just put it in the paint, dab, 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 and while the paint is wet, I use the end of a paintbrush and I scratch in all the trunks so that the background that's behind the trees, which is lighter, suddenly shows through. So I don't paint those trunks; they just scratch into the paint.
Yeah. It's absolute. It's the whole scene is like it's meant, and the engine itself, it just brings it all together. You don't know what to look at first.
The trestle that you see also scratched, but one of the things that most people forget about, on top of each of the vents is what they call fire decking. It's a piece of galvanized metal that sits on top of it and just folded over the sides and the end, because that's the worst place for hot cinders to fall, sit, and start fire.
Right. Yes, you're absolutely right. Attention to detail.
This is a scene in front of the roundhouse. This is what I did actually just recently. I've added the grass tufts here on this sort of dead spur off the turntable for the wheels, and the drum and the sawhorse and all this junk. I just started putting a collection of detail parts to fill that space, and then I got a group of figures that are standing on the other side, just having a conversation, talking about their day's events. This is 4 p.m. So
This is the end of the day.
That's right.
I'll meet you at O'Malley's. The first one's on you. I love the bicycle leaning against the wall between the.
When we talk about modeling structures in projects, the whole layout. I've got to build a huge layout in the same time frame with some kind of detail that people will build a 2-foot module. So like building a huge, any kind of a large structure, you got to do it in stages. So I liken this to levels of detail, because this doesn't happen at the beginning. The beginning is you do the track, and you put the buildings on, then you ballast everything, then you gravel and put sand in, then you put grass in, then you come back and you start adding tufts of weed, then you start adding the bits and pieces of detail, then you start adding the stuff along the sides of the wall. So you're building up layers of information. I have people come back each year and say, "Oh, I didn't see that last year." Well, I wasn't there last year. Oh, so they see new things every time they come back, because it's too much to do all at one time.
I'm sure.
That's a top view of the oil dock. Now, this is one of the scenes behind the pin-connected bridge. How I do sort of my backdrops, and this is all done with a fan brush and the sea sponge.
Nice, very nice. Bob Ross would be very proud.
Yeah, I learned a lot from him. Techniques and so on. The only difference is he used oil paints and wet on wet. I couldn't do that on this. This is all acrylics, and they dry too fast. So I wanted a rolling fog that's coming up the valley, and this is a good example on how to paint distance. That's one of the reasons I did this. Uh, you don't have detail at the far end, at the horizon. There's
Sure.
a mountain in the fog at the top left there. You know, it's way off. All of this is a shadow, and then I use the green coming forward because the aspen pop up between the pines. And one of the people, okay, so what happens with these areas over time, there are forest fires, and these forests of pine burn down. Well, as they come back, the ground has to be uh, maintained so you don't have slippage. And the aspen grow fast, and the aspen, believe it or not, one tree is connected to the next. All their root structures are from one tree.
Right.
And that's what holds everything together. So the aspen come up first, and then the pines slowly come up over years, and then the aspens die off. And eventually you'll end up with a pine forest. That's how this evolves. So
Right.
painting this is you got ridges coming down, and I had to do the fog rolling down in between each ridge. And as you come forward, the detail becomes sharper and sharper and sharper. And all the trees in the bottom right, the aspen, that's done with the sea sponge, which is quite a coarse texture. So you can get all those little sort of leafy effects. All I'm doing is dabbing the paint, the sponge in the paint, in 2 or 3 colors sometimes, and I'm just lightly dabbing them on the wall. I don't have to
Right.
do all that stuff. And
Very
then
nice.
I'll scratch the trunk in. And then the pines, that's just with a fan brush, just on edge. This is a tractor repair structure that there's a kit out, and it's actually quite a good kit. It's all individual boards. There was a structure that cantilevered out underneath the second floor, which is half that width. And I didn't think I was enough room to work for anybody to work under. So what I did is I extended the posts out twice the space, so that I had a larger space to put in a tractor and tools and shops and guys working and so on. And then I poured a plaster base as poured concrete, and it has cracks and weeds growing out of it and so on. And then those are LEDs lighting it up.
Very nice. Very detail orientated.
This is typical of one of my waterfalls. Every one is an experiment, and I learned how to do this on my last layout. I use casting resin. I don't use Envirotex. First of all, it pools flat, runs. I find it hard to control. This is casting resin that you buy at Michael's or any of those main hubs. It is smelly, but that goes away in a few hours. So it doesn't bother me.
Right.
So I use casting resin, and the waterfall itself is angel hair. If anybody not familiar with angel hair, it's those long fiberglass white stringy stuff that they hang on Christmas trees in the Christmas time. So I glue that. I build rock work across the lip of the river where it's going to drop, so that the resin behind it, when I'm pouring the river, stops and doesn't overflow. I use extra hardener in it so that it hardens within 5 minutes, doesn't flow, and then I will glue the bands of this fiber for the angel hair along the top, and I'll kind of bend it down and glue it on the bottom. And I'll pour the brush casting resin on it, and it's just like fiberglass mat, and then it just disappears in this form.
Right.
And then all the froth and so on the bottom, that's just little tiny tufts of filter from aquariums.
Oh, very nice.
And then with the resin that's on a brush, I'll just lightly dab it on that so that it sticks on it, so it looks like it's a lot of bubbles. This is 461 on the one of the two tracks that go to the turntable. The upper track feeds the coaling tower and the sand house. The small stone wall on the right and the bigger stone wall on the left, that's all stone by stone.
Wow.
A very soft stone that I could chip and break quite easy with a pair of pliers. It took, there's 5 feet of wall, and it's probably 2 inches high. And it took me a week of evenings. I thought it was an evenings job. It wasn't.
Nah.
Each stone one by one and stack them. To do that as a casting, there's no casting that looks like that to start with, and it would always look like a casting. But this is like a dry stone. Well, it's exactly what it looks like.
Very nice. Someone's calling him.
While we're waiting, I use all natural materials wherever I can for the ground. I always cover everything, plaster or plywood, with play sand, just enough to cover it. I glue it, and then I add whatever I'm going to put, grass or more dirt or grass on top of that, because if you ever move or damage anything for any reason, you're not going to see plywood or white plaster. So
Yeah, you see the sand underneath it.
sand.
Yeah. Explain about the hand railings around your layout. I find that interesting.
Well, just about every layout you've been to, you'll find the front edge of the layout is pretty much destroyed because people are sitting on the layout looking like this.
Just what I'm doing here on mine.
And, the scenery, if it's there, is damaged. I don't want that to happen. So I took some standard handrails from the lumber yard, and I fastened them around the layout, 4 inches down from the layout. And now what people do, and there is an image of me as an example somewhere, right there. So now I'm leaning comfortably on the layout. My main layout is 54 inches high, and just painted the handrail to match the fascia. And now I can lean on that, or anybody can look at the layout without touching the layout.
Excellent, excellent, brilliant, actually.
People want to stay in one spot. There's so much to see, and they want to look at stuff.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We're showing the video now, John? Oh, John's got his mic on.
So while we're waiting, to me, at least for me, the layout is a piece of art.
Yes.
It should be looked at independent of the room. So what I've done is I have the fascia, which is tempered masonite that wraps around the whole facade, and it's painted what I call boiler gray, which is just obviously a dark gray. All the flooring is carpet tile and it's dark. And then all the walls up to the wall mural, which actually comes down just slightly below the tabletop height, is dark as well. So when you come into the room, all you see is the color of the layout. I've seen people use other colors, everything, I kid you not, from green to orange, which I couldn't believe. And then that's all you see is green or whatever the color is. It should be neutral. Everything should be neutral outside of that, whether it's brown or gray. And dark colors always make a dark background always makes the color jump out.
Right.
And so when you come in the room, it's that's what you see is the background down to the layout surface. And I don't put anything under the layout. It's all open. The island has got legs every a pair of legs every 8 feet, which spans the L girders. It's just 2 by 2. There's nothing stored underneath, so that it floats. And when it hits the wall, all the layout is hung on brackets off the wall. There's no legs around the wall, perimeter walls. Everything is on gussets.
Nice. Unfortunately, mine's not like that. There's clutter everywhere.
But you're comfortable.
I'm comfortable. I can get around in it.
That's all.
Okay.
This is just a series of short videos that I use for my header on Facebook. It does have sound, by the way. Yeah, well, this is just drifting. Yeah, that was a real short one. That's the other stock pen in Charmer, which has cattle and horses. The one in Osier is all sheep. And you'll notice in the bottom there's a cattle guard. That's all scratch built. And there's no cattle guards between the rails available, so that's all scratch built. Keeps the cattle out of the yard. This is the sheep one that's in Osier, where they're herding the sheep in. And the stock car's on your bottom right off that little spur.
Oh yeah, yes.
And there are kits for stock pens, but they're so perfect. I went down to Charm and I measured and all the type of details that the pens are made out of. There may be a photograph later on. I can show you a couple of things that I did that you don't find in kits. This is my second favorite trestle. That's all. I measured that trestle. That's all scratch built timbers. That's a Howe through truss. It's probably about 3 feet long.
Andy Crawford wants to know, Lex, he says, I notice switches with points. Where do you stand on stub switches?
I don't use stub switches.
There you go, Andy.
I'm not sure if that was enough of an answer for him.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right.
What's actually interesting when I did my because it's spline, I used this one of the splines, which would be 1/4 inch by 1.5 inches, and I would use that on all the girders to mark where the center line of each track is, and even on the yard. So when I came to a switch, I didn't use switches that are numbered, so you don't go, like this. I used the spline as a centerpiece on a smooth curve, as if it was a main line going through the switch, so that the train, just moves slightly, not jerking like a number 8 or 10, 9, 10 switch would do. It worked really well because I've got several through the yard that are switches on curves. Those are fun to build.
I'm sure they are. I am sure they are.
All
right. Well, is that it for the photos and the video? Well, Lex, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and join us on Model Railroading Live and Who's Big Bill Talking To. I have to tell you, it was an honor to have you on the Usually I'm a very chatty New Yorker.
Well,
And,
yeah, I enjoy this. To me, the hobby is about inspiring people because I've been inspired, and then the hobby is about sharing of ideas. And that's really what it's all about.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the mantra that we have here at Model Railroading Live. This is part of what we want to do, and bringing gentlemen like you on, and sharing their knowledge and sharing their experience and wisdom with us is by far the best.
I appreciate that comments, but as I say, it is a two-way. It's a win-win.
Yeah, and a happy birthday to you. I wish you the best of health and happiness and peace and whatever. But I thank you very much again for being a part of this and being on this show with us. Let's see. Ken Amos Jr., BNO 51. Thank you, gentlemen, for a great show tonight. Thank you, Lex, for being part of this show tonight as well. Dear Dave BNSF N Scale, this is an awesome show. Great episode. Dave Piper, the photos don't do it justice. You're absolute. Ralph Renzetti wrote that. I am sure when they take the restraining, when the courts take the restraining order off me, I'll make my way to Canada.
There's a note for everybody. I am on Facebook. You can easily find me. But I have a website that has a lot more images and videos. I have tutorials on there as well. Some of the magazines that I've been published in are on there. And you can find that at www.drgwrr.com. So Denver Western Railroad, Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, drgwrr.com.
There you go. There you go. Well, thank you again, Lex. Tomorrow night's Thursday, the 10th of October, and that's going to be Johnny's Train Talk Show, where Johnny's going to invite you down to the old general store there, and you can pull up a chair at the checkerboard, play some checkers with Johnny, and talk about model railroading. You can talk about tonight's show if you'd like and what you learned, or if you have a problem or a situation on model railroading, come along to Johnny's Train Talk Show. We'd be more than happy to help you, as well as we have other visitors that come in and pop in. You too can be a part of this, just like we are tonight. John will put up the link for tomorrow evening, and you can join in if you have a webcam and a good internet service. You can join in and be, if you're working on a project, bring it along. If you have a problem, let's talk about it. Model railroading, nothing else. We're not psychiatrists or social workers. We're just model railroaders. But anyway, so that's it. Once again, Lex, thank you so very, very much for being a part of this. It was a great honor and a privilege to talk with you.
Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you guys out there in the community for being a part of this, because without you watching, we're dead air. So take care, God bless, and we'll see you guys on the radio.